But the reason why 16th century Anabaptists that Luther and Calvin opposed and evangelicals are just completely different categories is that the 16th century Anabaptists were opposed by Luther and Calvin for a whole slew of reasons, including their social views, which were often radically subversive. So a lot of the Anabaptists believed that Christians should not serve in the government or hold a public office. Christians should not take oaths. It's not a Christian church if there are sinners within it. They had different views of divorce. Sometimes they denied original sin and imputed righteousness. Lots of other heretical beliefs you can find floating around, but the real key is their radical social views. Basically, some of them are similar to what we would call today communists. They believed in the abolition of private property, so they were seen as a menace and a threat to the social fabric. Basically, they were seen as sort of anarchists. And in some cases, that's sort of how they were functioning. So lots of Anabaptists supported the German Peasants' War in 1524, 1525, where you've got hundreds of thousands of people getting slaughtered, and you've got Anabaptist preachers like Thomas Munzer preaching these apocalyptic messages about God's judgment is coming. It's going to be disruptive. Christians need to participate in that, and so on and so forth. That is what is going on in the 16th century that is so concerning to Luther and Calvin.
Now, I think to a lot of evangelicals, including myself, many or all of these are going to sound pretty darn condemnatory and pretty darn problematic. So then I guess my question is, how fair do you think Gavin's criticism is? How fair do you think that list is?
Yeah, and I'll say, because I know you guys are friendly, and you talked during his hell conditionalism presentation recently. If I say anything critical of him, that's just me talking. You're not. I don't want you to get in trouble for platforming.
He can take criticism. I know him. Yeah.
So I mean, I agree with him that modern evangelicals aren't a lot like the early Anabaptists, but not for the same reasons that he gives. So unfortunately, there's, I would say, his criticisms fall into different categories. Some are broad generalizations. Some are maybe places where he's allowed aberrations to speak for the movement as a whole. And then also maybe just some statements that are maybe false or just misleading. And so, first of all, he tries to tie the early Anabaptists to the German peasants' revolt. But the revolt was wrapping up when Anabaptism was beginning. There were some who were involved in it who became Anabaptists later. There's also maybe some who were involved who were kind of friendly with the Anabaptists, like Thomas Munzer. He wasn't one of them, but he wrote to a couple of them. But it wasn't an Anabaptist movement. And you know what? I'm gonna take just a minute to talk about the Peasants' Revolt.
That's okay.
Much of what we think about the Peasants' Revolt came from Luther and Luther apologists. And you ought to read the 12 articles of the Peasants' Revolt sometime if you haven't. They included demands like freedom of each community to appoint their own pastor, the release of peasants from serfdom on the basis that they were equal to landowners through the blood of Christ and shouldn't be treated as slaves, that they'd be allowed to fish and hunt and collect firewood in the land that they lived in, and the abolition of the death tax. And so the revolt was really rooted in, honestly, Luther's own complaints about the Roman Catholic Church and an emphasis on Christian freedom. And Luther supported them kind of at first in a lukewarm way, but then ultimately he took the side of the princes and the feudal lords, and he proclaimed that the peasants should be strangled like mad dogs. So Anabaptists are pacifists, so they wouldn't have supported either side of the war. And of course, wars always create atrocities and immoral acts on both sides. But I think, pressed to choose which side has a more righteous cause, I would say the peasants. I mean, the peasants' revolt was in a sense a slave revolt. And while it brought about some evil things, I feel like Luther sort of taking the side of the self-designated owners of the peasants wasn't really the right answer. But it's kind of irrelevant because ultimately that it wasn't an Anabaptist movement. But to attempt to maybe kind of work quickly through Ortlund's other charges against the Anabaptists as quickly as I can.
Yeah.
Is he said Anabaptists believe there should be no Christians in government, right? Okay, well, that's largely kind of true. There's an exception there. There's a guy named Balthasar Hubmaier who was in a city where he had some influence. He was kind of okay with Christians being involved with government, even their violent functions. But mostly, other than him, all the Anabaptists were largely pacifist. They didn't think that Christians should be involved in the violent functions of government. I mentioned Pilgrim Marpeck. He was a Anabaptist leader and a civil engineer. He was okay with Christians getting involved in some government functions. But in contrast, though, because remember, Ortlund is saying we should follow in the vein of the Protestant reformers. Luther argued that Christians should follow the Sermon on the Mount as Christians, but that as citizen soldiers, they should kill and slay as ordered, and that on the battlefield, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Christian and a heathen. Those are his words. Now, Ortlund thinks Luther went too far, but that ultimately Luther's views were less problematic than the peace-loving Anabaptists, and I disagree. He said, there's a second one, Ortlund said that Anabaptists believe that a church couldn't be Christian if it had any sinners in it. And I think he misunderstands what Anabaptists were arguing against. So we talked about the visible versus the invisible church idea. And Anabaptists, which to reiterate it just really quickly, is that there's a visible state church that could be distinguished from the invisible church of the truly saved. And Anabaptists like Peter Riedemann argued, and this is a quote, that the church is an assembly of the children of God. Sounds pretty uncontroversial. But he wasn't saying that every Anabaptist was saved, or that if there was a single unsaved person in an Anabaptist congregation, that meant the whole church was illegitimate. He was saying that intentionally creating a church full of unrepentant sinners, as the Protestants de facto supported, was illegitimate.
By virtue of their marriage of church and state, you mean?
You got it. Yeah. So if everybody in Germany is a Protestant now, now, does that mean everybody in Germany is saved? No, and they were fine with that ultimately, right? That was fine, because they valued the church, the state church, more than they did a believer's church.
So maybe it would be more fair to say that they don't think that a church designed to be inclusive of masses of non-Christians is not a church.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to phrase what they're saying. So I think that's
it's fine. That makes sense, actually.
Yeah, makes sense to me too. Yeah. So yeah, and ultimately they thought that Luther and Calvin were encouraging something different, something that was called a church, but wasn't really anything like what Paul talked about when he talked about the church.
Okay, but what about the third item I listed, right? I was a Christian for 3 or 4 or 5 years before my wife became one. She and I got married in 2001 as atheists. 2000, I think it was actually. And I became a Christian about a year later. And then she didn't become a Christian until 3 or 4 or 5 years later. And from what Gavin says in that video, and I think there's at least some element of truth to this, there were Anabaptists who did endorse or at least condone Christian spouses leaving their non-Christian spouses and indeed children. And that to me is as bad as if they were Unitarian, as far as I'm concerned. So do you think is there a legitimacy to that criticism, or?
Yeah, so that one was kind of new on me when I heard him say it. I mean, all the early confessions of the Anabaptists that I looked at only gave adultery or abandonment by an unbelieving spouse as a legitimate reason for divorce. There were even a couple that I read that positively said that unbelief couldn't separate spouses. But after I heard him say that, I tried to find some examples of it. And I did find a secondhand claim that some early Anabaptists did that. And if so, that would be obviously horrible. And I would be opposed to that too. I don't get a sense that it was widespread or took over the whole movement based on, like I said, all the major early confessions that I read, that all of them talk about marriage or divorce to some extent. Almost all of them do. But yeah, obviously that would be wrong. So I think here, if Gavin is correct about that was happening, and I assume that he is, there must be something there to it. I think that would be an example of him defining Anabaptism by its aberrations. And but when it comes to things that all the magisterial reformers believe, like death for heretics, he sort of goes, well, mistakes were made. Yeah. To me that's a bigger deal.
I imagine that when it comes to his claim that the Anabaptists denied original sin and the imputed righteousness of Christ, I suspect, tell me if I'm wrong, this has more to do with a difference in understanding of original sin and the imputed righteousness of Christ, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think you'd sent me some of the notes ahead of time. I think we may get original sin in more detail later. But here I might say just a little bit about imputed righteousness. So I didn't generally see imputed righteousness spelled out in Anabaptist primary source documents in the way that Protestants would want to phrase it. I think Menno Simons gets maybe the closest to sounding like a Protestant. He wrote, since no one under heaven has perfectly fulfilled the righteousness required of God, but Jesus Christ alone, therefore none can approach God, obtain grace, and be saved, except by the perfect righteousness, atonement, and intercession of Jesus Christ.
That sounds pretty close to imputed righteousness, yeah.
So the difference here, I think, is largely one of emphasis, and it goes back to kind of what we were talking about in terms of what the Reformed were focused on, or the Protestants were focused on, versus the Anabaptists. For Reformers, salvation was primarily punctiliar, which I can say to you because I know you took Greek. It means that they were focused on salvation happened at a point in time. It was that moment of justification, and at that point, it's largely complete. There's stuff that comes after, but that's kind of a footnote. The main stuff is really there at the beginning. And, I think they were trying to avoid legalism, work salvation, that kind of thing. So that the motive is good. But Anabaptists really saw salvation as ongoing. I think ultimately Anabaptists would not have seen imputed righteousness alone as good news. We weren't just imputed Adam's sin. We were in Adam, and we became sinful and enslaved to death and sin as a result of that. But now that we're in Christ, yes, we're considered good, and that's great. But more than that, we're made good because we're united to Christ. And so everything comes with that.
Doesn't Paul say we were saved unto good works that the Father's prepared for us? Something along those lines?
Yeah, that as well. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think they just see it. Actually, that might have been Peter, but yes, one of them said it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's really just a difference in emphasis. I don't think that they would have really said, yeah, we disagree with imputed righteousness. They just would have said, okay, right. Like, where do you go from there? And there was one more.
Private property. Did they not believe?
Yeah. So I've already gone, I think, a long time on the Ortlund thing. So I'll try to be brief here. So not all Anabaptists taught the community of goods, which Ortlund somewhat glibly described as communism. They would have called it the community of goods. Some did. The Hutterites did, for example. But what's really important here is they taught it as a voluntary practice for Christians who joined their communities. So if you are joining our community voluntarily, this is how we live together.
But you couldn't join their community and not and still exercise private property, right?
That's true. Yeah. I mean, they have, maybe personal houses or personal property and stuff like that. But it's ultimately like, kind of shared facilities, shared kitchens, they would sort of farm together and everybody was sort of taken care of. And it's a little bit like, I mean, when people talk about like universal healthcare, I guess, but done without taxation, because as you get older in a Hutterite community and you can't work anymore, you're still given the same portion of food that everyone else is given. You still have a place to live, and so there's some really good things about it, I think. But ultimately, yeah, if you were convinced that this was what Jesus wanted you to do, and you joined a Hutterite community, that was a choice that you made. And, all appropriate respect to Gavin. And I've appreciated a lot of what I've seen him say elsewhere. I mean, he can call that radical or extreme if he wants to, but the reality is that the magisterial reformers that he holds up as models murdered the so-called radical reformers. So forced to choose between the property sharing Hutterites and the murderous Martin Luther, I'll take the Hutterites. But thankfully I can chew the meat and spit out the bones, and I can also take the good stuff from Luther.